So far we've written a property method, and we've written two types or two flavors of constructors. Now what we want to do is to write a general method that becomes part of the user interface. In other words, we want to write a method that is going to be in the class, but we're going to expose to the outside world so they can use it. So what we'll do is segment it off like we have everything else, and we'll call it a general method. There's nothing etched in stone about the format that you have to follow for a general method. Oops, I noticed that I misspelled general. So we'll go and spell general and go back. You can write the code, other than a few basic guidelines, you can write it in any way you want. What I'm going to do is use a format that my company used for years, starting with the old C compilers of 30 years ago, and we continue to use to this day. We always started any general method that we wrote in a class, or a function for that matter, and we started it out with a sequence of a slash and 5 asterisks, because that is a lead-in for a comment. And then Microsoft takes over and formats it for us after that point. And I always start with the purpose of the general purpose methods. And the reason is because this is going to form part of the interface that you're going to use. I'm going to close this window. We don't need it right now. That'll give us a little more real estate. Okay. I always start off any general method with a statement of what the purpose of the method is, and also any parameters that are returned to it, as well as the return value from the method. So I'm going to say this general purpose method is to determine if a specified year is a leap year. Now, there'll be cases where you're going to put an algorithm in here that you haven't memorized. And if that's the case, and you're working in an environment where there's more than yourself as the programmer, one of the things that we always would type in would be the source for the algorithm. And now, if anybody then wants to question the algorithm, or if they're having issues with it, they can go to a particular book, look it up, and find out exactly what's wrong. Then the next thing that I do is type in what are the parameters that have to be passed to this for this thing to work correctly. And in this case, the only thing that we have to pass in is the year, and that's just the year to be tested. Then the return value in this case is an int. All right, this is different than what you're going to find in the Java, the C#, and the C++ libraries. Most methods that return an answer to a leap year question return true or false. And I'm returning 1 or 0, and there's a reason for doing that. But before I get to that, let's finish. That ends the comment. In other words, I have a lead-in of a slash followed by 5 asterisks, and then at the end I have 5 asterisks and a closing slash. And the reason that I did it that way is I actually have code that my company wrote that will go out and look for that sequence of slash 5 asterisks, and it knows that the next line begins the documentation for a method. And I also know then that when I read 5 asterisks and a closing slash, that marks the end of that comment. So once every week what we would do is run that program against our source code, and we would end up with a fresh set of documentation for all of the methods that were in our library. And the file also took the signature of the method, which is what I'm going to write next. So it would know that reading these lines in between these lead-in comment and closing comment documented what this particular function was about. So I knew that after the document is closed, or the lead-in document is closed, the next line was the signature for the method. And our little program would go through all the source code and update the documentation for the methods. And we found out that we could take a new programmer, hand them that manual, and they were up and running in probably half the time that it would take with a search, a help list. So the first thing that we want to do in here is set a return flag. Now, where did return flag come from? If you'll recall, one of the properties that we have is return flag. So that's already been defined, and we make it available for all of the methods that use it. That should be a capital F. That's why it's complaining. Then the algorithm is if year modulo 4 is 0 and the year modulo 100 is 0. I'm sorry, is not equal to 0. Or the year modulo 400 equals 0. It turns out meeting those conditions is a leap year, so we return 1. Else now we only use return flag if it does not end up being a leap year. Otherwise it's going to return 0. Return flag is always going to be 0. If you want, you could do this. And that would then retain the state of the return flag based on this calculation for leap year. All right. Oh, that's okay. Now let's go back to our code. Now if I type in my date, you'll notice I have a new method called isLeapYear. And the reason is because I used the public access specifier when I wrote it. And that means that I'm making it available as part of the user interface into this class. People who use my class now, other programmers, now have a method that will determine whether it's a leap year. Now let's go back to let's get rid of that because we'll come back to it. And remember this label that we put on here? Let's go look at the property list for that. All right, now, before we can change any of the properties, we have to stop the program from running, so we'll go up and stop the program. We'll go to that particular label. And because we're going to reference it in the program, we need to give it a meaningful name. So we'll say label leap year message. And go back to our code, and we'll say label BL, and you'll notice it pops it up, and if I hit the tab key, I get it. And then I say text equals, And what I'm going to say is year, and then I'm going to use the year that they actually typed in. But since this is string data, I really need to make the year object a string, so I can do that using the toString method. And then continue the string and say year 2012 has, and now I can take year plus my date dot is leap year plus days. Now, what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, leap year has this many days, but I don't know how many days there are. I've just typed in the word year, and I've typed in leap year. So let's go back to the class code, and let's put something else into one of the properties. And specifically, what we're going to do is static. I'm sorry, I don't need to do the string part. We have days in the month. This is why I typed it in. Days in the month is going to be a record of how many days are normally in a non-leap year year. So if I go back to main and I type in here my date dot get days, right now it's going to be confused because there is no get days function. So what I have to do then is go back to my class and write a very simple method. And once again, I'll just cut and paste. And I know you're not supposed to do this, but don't tell me you guys don't do this. We'll change the comment. Find the number of days in a given month. Now, because we're starting this information or the data in the array at an unusual point, the first element, we use zero-based arrays in C#. Because we're using 1 as the first thing, we should probably put a caution in here. And what we're going to tell them is this is not a zero-based array. January equals month 1. Okay, so that will point them at least in the right direction as to what this particular method expects to be passed into it. And it expects the data that comes in to be passed in a way that makes sense to most people. And that is the first month is January, not February. So we're going to say public int get days we better use, this will make it clear which month. And then we can check. We can say if which month is greater than 0 and which month is less than 13, we have a valid index into the array. So we can say return days in month, which month, else, I don't want the paragraph marker there. Return, and let's return a -1. So up here we'll say 0 or 1 if okay, -1 on error. So this is the month that we want to check. The return value is still going to be an int, but in this case the interpretation is going to be different. We're going to return a -1 if something goes wrong with the range of days. So now we can go back to main, and you'll notice in this particular section of code we've called two methods now in the class dates class. One is to get the days in February, and the other one is then to calculate whether this is a leap year or not. Now recall that isLeapYear returns a 1 if it is a leap year and 0 if not. Whereas getDays is just going to return 28 no matter what, because that's what we hard-coded into the array. The problem is that both of these are numeric pieces of data. So I want to print this in a string though, so I can do a parentheses at the lead of those two numbers and a parentheses at the end. And now what I'm saying is, okay, I have a value, and I know it's an integer value, that I want to print out as a single number as a string, so I just hit a period, and I can pick out the toString method, and I have to type in the parentheses. And now this will print out the combined 28 days plus a 1 or a 0, add them together, and it will print out then either 28 or 29, depending on whether we have a leap year or not. This is why my version is different than what you find in most libraries, because most libraries are going to return true or false, which requires an if test then for you to add 1 or not to a particular value. Almost always the 28 or the 29 is going to be used subsequently in some other calculation. In this case, we're just using it to point out the number of days in the year. So why bother with the if test if we don't need it? We've already done that check in the class dates example. So now when we run this program and we type in 2012, which is a leap year, let's get rid of that breakpoint and run it. You can see that we have 29 days in the year 2012. Now, clearly, if I type in 2011 and do the calculation, it should return 28 days because that's not a leap year. So this is just a simple example of how we can use the class dates then to directly calculate the number of days in a leap year or not. All right? So what we have is written a new general method that allows us to manipulate the number of days in a year rather directly than indirectly, followed by an if test. To me, that's useful. Some people may be less useful. Now, the other thing that we've done, we so far have written two general methods. One that gives us isLeapYear. The other one is to determine the number of days in a month. The next thing that we want to do is to determine what it is to determine the date that Easter falls upon. And that's a little bit more complex than the getDays or the leap year function. But still, the lead-in is going to be pretty much the same as before. So we'll go up here, grab the header, come down. Another thing that you can do, if you didn't know that, you can highlight a section of code and hit the tab key and it will tab the entire block over. In this case, it's to determine the date for Easter. And actually, you can use the same reference book. He's a very nice guy, by the way. And the signature, in this case, is a little different in that we're going to return a string for get Easter. And we do have to pass in the year. Now, the date for calculating Easter is dependent upon the lunar calendar, and I'm not about to go through and explain the lunar calendar, so you're just going to have to do a leap of faith here. You might be asking yourself why all of these are private methods or private data points. I have used temporary variables, and this is a common practice that I think in real complex calculations are useful, because if you have all of these calculations on a single line, it's difficult to see intermediate results. And if you're doing the math by hand as a check, intermediate variables are very useful. So that's one of the reasons that I'm doing it this way. Leap is maybe a misnomer here, because we're not really calculating a leap year in this case. It's slightly different than a leap year calculation. Now here we have this math that is based upon intermediate values, and they have to do with the lunar calendar. If you're interested, you can find the explanation for this on the internet by just looking up Easter calculations, and chances are you'll find the same algorithm that this one's based on. Why is it unhappy with that? Oops, that's why. If the calculation produces a month total that's greater than 31, we know actually that the month is April. So we're going to set the index to April, and that will allow us to index into an array. And by subtracting 31, because March has 31 days in it, we can find exactly which day is left. Otherwise, the month must be March. Whoops, forgot the equal sign. And then we use another one of the built-in date time class objects. And this is a constructor that's overloaded and has 3 parameters to it. And we're going to do a long date string. Now, if we've done all of this correctly, we should be able to run this. And once we're over here, go to our design make room for our we'll just make a copy of that, but we're going to call it Easter now. So we have label Easter. And then go back to our code, and we'll say label Easter dot text equals my date dot, and then we can do get Easter for year. So now when we run this, we should be able to see if it's a leap year and also if it is, or I'm sorry, the date that Easter falls on. So when we run this, type in 2012, we can see that Sunday, April 8th will be the date for Easter this year. So what we have now is this very specific class that is capable of determining if a year is a leap year and the exact day that Easter falls on in that given year. If we change this, we should find that it's not a leap year, and we get a different date, of course, for Easter. All right, what we've done then here so far is to show you a style of writing general methods. General methods, as we said, will always have the public access specifier because they form a public part of the interface for the way to get at the data. And we make all of the property methods private by default. And if we want to get at those individual property methods, properties, we have to write a property method for each one.